So I'm Alisa Wade, and I'm going to start off talking mostly about the forest chapter in the Montana Climate Assessment. And then I'm going to touch really briefly on a lot of work. I've done a lot of work on fish, on salmonids, and so I'm just going to touch really quickly on that, but given my time, I probably won't go very in depth. So on the Montana Climate Assessment, Nick was the numbers guy. I guess I'm the impacts gal, or one of them. And I want to say that there were 3 other co-authors on that chapter, Ash Ballantyne, Andrew Larson, and Matt Jolly with UM and or the Forest Service. So some context, there's about 23 million acres of forested land in Montana, and you can see that most of it's on the west, but it certainly isn't to say that there aren't a number of trees and forests throughout the state and of equal importance throughout the state. Most of this is on public lands, and without getting into a lot of detail about how different lands are managed, I will say that how climate change affects forests will be strongly dependent on the underlying situation or health of those forests. And those are really different across the state. And so whatever we say when we're talking about overlaying climate on top of that, that you always have to go back to the original health of that forest, and those are really different for various reasons: management, species, etc. When we did this in the climate report, we wanted to look at 2 different main effects. And a lot of times forests science is divided in this way, as how direct effects of climate affect forests. So direct effects, I mean things that are natural processes for trees and forests, such as establishment and regeneration, growth and productivity, and mortality. And then also we looked at indirect impacts. So in addition to just hot weather affects a tree and affects a forest, you also have these following indirect impacts, and those are largely, you can think of them as disturbance. And here I'm going to focus on fire, and we talked about pathogens and insects. Here I'm just going to talk about beetles. So I won't go too much into this because Nick just did this, but we needed to make some assumptions, and these are, for this report, it was all based on Nick's data, Nick and Kelsey's data. So temperature, it's been increasing, it's going to continue to increase. We know it, incredibly strong evidence for that. Precipitation, we see a little bit, as Nick said, a little bit different, but we're making some assumptions here that going forward, we're going to see a little bit of increase over the rest of the year and decreases in summer precip. And without getting into much detail here, because I don't have the time, I'll say that seasonality really matters, okay? It's not just what is the average across the year. A tree is growing at a certain time and needs water at a certain time. A fish needs water in the river at a certain time. And without thinking about that, you lose the story. So I'm going to average it all, and we're going to lose a lot of the story, but I want you to keep that in the back of your head when you think about this on your own a little bit more in more depth. Growing season, it's been increasing. It will continue to increase. And then drought is a naturally occurring thing. We all know that. There's a lot of different numbers in how you can calculate drought. And the important piece here is that even though precipitation, we're not really sure about the story there, hot weather increases, it makes things dry up, okay? That's part of drought. So even if you don't think too much about the precip, with hotter temperatures, you're going to see increased drought or increased aridity in certain situations. And so we're not going to say much here, at least in our assumptions about the forest chapter. We didn't say much about the increase in frequency of drought, but certainly when it does occur, it will very, very likely be more severe. All right. So direct effects, I think it's really important to say that there are going to be positive impacts from climate change. Absolutely. There's going to be positive and there's going to be negative. And what kind of the long-term story is then is what are those net effects. So CO2 is absolutely increased concentrations in the air. Those increase establishment and regeneration. However, higher temperatures reduce seedling survival, for example. And this is just one, a couple examples here. And so overall, the net effect probably for establishment and regeneration is that it will be kind of up and down, largely driven by climate oscillations. And I was really hoping Nick would say what a climate oscillation is. I'm sure you guys all know ENSO, right? And El Nino, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And so you get these multiple oscillations throughout the year. They're totally natural. They've been happening for millennia. But they have a funny thing where certain different oscillations will overlap with each other. So sometimes what if Pacific Decadal Oscillation overlaps with the dry season of ENSO, you get a really dry. And so you get this funny signal across mixing and matching of these things called climate oscillations. And what we'll probably see is that a lot of changes in net effect will be driven by these climate oscillations, When they co-occur to create wet seasons, we'll see a really big increase in establishment and regeneration. When they're fighting with each other, we might not see much of a change. And so they really kind of got to tell the story for establishment and regeneration. Same little story, probably approximate story with growth and productivity. We know that with increased temperature, you see increased water use efficiency. How plants use water is actually they adapt and they do better. And you have increased productivity, longer growing season, plus there is such a thing as CO2 fertilization. So with increased CO2 in the air, you actually get better productivity. However, when you have water limitation, there's an extreme reduction in growth and productivity. So again, we'll probably see a really strong story being told by climate oscillations, but overall, likely a positive gains at higher elevations in growth and productivity in forested area. However, that is really dependent on stand density. If there's a billion trees, they can't take, the poor little trees are all struggling with each other. There's not enough room for them to take advantage of that. So it's going to be really dependent on stand density. So where there's low stand density, increased gains at higher elevations. Mortality is a totally different story. The trees are going to die. Okay, that pretty much says it all. There's going to be increased mortality, and there's really no benefit there. Direct temperature, a lot of that is just hot temperatures kill trees, and but also there's a lot of increased disturbance, which I'll get into. Those indirect effects largely drive that. So, and we've already seen this across the Pacific Northwest. I won't even say what the Y and X axis are. Just know those trends are showing that the little upswing is saying there's been increased mortality across the Pacific Northwest over the last 60, 100 years. So what does that mean overall for range shifts or distribution of trees throughout Montana? There can be expansion with warmer temperatures and if there's sufficient moisture in areas with sufficient moisture. But range contraction is most likely, especially when temperatures get really hot to a threshold that just kills the trees, and then in water-limited areas. And so you have a potential faster range contraction than expansion. That's probably likely, leading to an overall loss of forested area in Montana. I don't know if I even want to talk about this, but a lot of people say, well, won't the trees just move uphill and kind of like, and that will happen, and sometimes vegetation is known to kind of just go climb the mountain and trying to seek that temperature optimum, but plants also go downhill chasing water optimums, and so you get this crisscrossing of the story, and what you end up is that often leads to range contraction. All right, oops. So then let's talk a little bit about fire. So now we're going to move to indirect effects. Fires, we know they've increased across the West because of increasing aridity. The fire season has lengthened. That has been shown to be true. And this is going to likely continue with warmer weather. And also a really big piece here is past management practices. Obviously, we have a long way to go before the forests reset themselves from fire suppression policy. You just get this that's a lot of fuel on the ground. And forests are, you add in hotter temperatures and potentially drier summers, and then these really dense stands, and that's a big deal long-term for increased fire. And I won't get into feedbacks either, because this story can get, you can go forever down any rabbit hole, but really important to note that forests are one of the biggest sinks, carbon store. So that's where carbon out of the atmosphere goes. It goes into trees. When you burn the trees, the carbon just goes straight back up. So if we burn a lot of trees, it's a feedback cycle where we're just pumping more carbon into the atmosphere, warmer temperatures, etc. So yeah, I already talked about that, lengthened fire season. And then beetles. The story for pathogens and insects is a little bit varied. It really depends on site-specific locations, but an easy story to tell is that of the mountain pine beetle. And I think we won't see anything like what we saw in 2008 and 2009 with these really huge peaks in pine beetle populations and epidemics, and that's largely because we've lost a lot of the host trees. Epidemics for pine beetles rely on, we've got to have trees for them to eat. So no trees, no pine beetle explosions. But where there are host trees, we're definitely going to see more pine beetle activity. Without going too detail in this graphic, what it's showing is that there's a certain temperature in winter at which, and that temperature varies because these little bugs are adapting. Like, oh, it's kind of cold in September, but by December they can handle a lot of cold. They get ready for it. They get this antifreeze going. So that temperature matters kind of when the temperature's spiking. but pretty much across all scenarios, the days above that temperature threshold just increase every month. What that means is you see just a ton more pine beetles surviving through the winter and being able to have an explosion in pine beetle activity if given host trees. So some key messages. How long do I have? Oh, great. Okay, some real quick key messages about direct effects. Increases in temperature will be positive or negative depending on local stand and site conditions. Direct effects will ultimately for us will be largely driven by water availability. So both those climate oscillations and then also just where you are on the landscape and what the water availability is there. However, the important piece of this, I think, story is that the speed and magnitude of climate change may mean that increased forest mortality and contractions in forest distribution, so leading to a net loss of forested area in Montana. And then some key messages for indirect effects. We've seen and will continue to see increases in fire size, frequency, and possible severity. So that's the amount of kind of the death rate of a tree within a fire. So the severity of fire, that's possible also in the coming century. And part of that is due to climate, but a lot of that's due to past management practices as well, with climate overlaying on top of that. And rising temperatures are likely to increase disturbance from forest insects, not all of them, but some of them. And big piece is that there will probably be an increase in the reduction in the amount of carbon stored in forests. Some key messages, just some additional thoughts about forests so you don't go home, is that forests have evolved and adapted for billions of years, and we need to understand that they have this adaptive capacity over millions of years. They've developed it, and if we can, it's not hopeless that with a little bit of help they can continue to survive. But the response will be spatially complex, and this will largely be driven probably by indirect effects as well as, and it'll be second to the climate change impacts will be secondary to those kind of past management practices. And then feedbacks are a big part of the story, but we're not going to get into it. All right, I want to really quickly talk a little bit about fish. This is work I did funded by NASA, but the Flathead Lake Biological Station, as well as some work I did with the Clark Brook Coalition and the Forest Service. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but just to say, salmonids are a great way to think about climate change because they live in the water. They're just directly affected. Air temperature has a big increase on water. They're not only affected by temperature, they're affected by flow. And the bull trout are a great way to think about it too because they're a salmonid. Trouts are salmonids. So they're a salmonid, and they require some of the coldest habitat of all salmonids. So they really need cold water, so they're really quickly impacted by changing climate. In occupancy modeling, we know that bull trout are strongly sensitive to air temp, water temp, as well as frequency of winter floods and projected water. If you have faster snow melt, you get these real big flash floods coming out earlier in the spring, and a bigger freshet that has a huge impact on washing away the fry, the little baby fish. And so there's been a ton of work already done that looking at how increased air temperature, water temperature, and changes in water flow have a big impact on bull trout. And I just wanted to show a couple maps of water temperature for bull trout. So this is a different data set. I think it's really interesting that it shows almost identical trends to the stuff that Nick has been using. So I think that's something that we're seeing over and over again, especially when you talk about temperatures, is that you see the same story coming out. So that provides a lot of evidence that these models are doing a pretty good job. But this is called the normalized data set. So this is a historical look at in Montana of the water temperatures that have been modeled. This is what the historical water temperatures are looking at. Red is basically you can think of it as too hot for bull trout. Blue is kind of cold for bull trout. They like it, but it's a little cold. And then green's kind of their little sweet spot. And as we move forward into the 2040s, I went too fast there. 2040s, you can see the red kind of increasing. You're losing their area of ideal temperature. And in the 2080s, you get a lot of red, which means it's just getting really hot for the bull trout. And bull trout are one of our key species. Now, a lot of other salmonids can do better in these kinds of temperatures. Bull trout are going to have a really rough time. And there's a number of papers about me already kind of looking at this throughout the whole Pacific Northwest, that the dark blue here, all the colors represent the historical kind of bull trout habitat. And then the darkest blue is what would likely to be remaining with a 5 Celsius increase. And we're very likely on target for that kind of temperature. So with that, I'll just say thanks. And